Good evening. Welcome to the Reinier de Graaf's lecture here at the Berlage. My name is Vedran Mimica, directing the institute, and of course it's a pleasure to have Reinier back here to the Berlage to work with a group of students from Berlage Institute and Strelka Institute of Architecture from Moscow on Megalopolitics, which is the title of the masterclass, which Reinier and Lara Bird are running with this group of students. This lecture is clearly the part of that event, and I do hope that many of you which are working already for 4 days with Reinier will be furtherly enlightened with this lecture and will be basically able to use it in your work. As for the other guests, of course, you will see what Reinier has been doing in a capacity of as a partner at OMA and director of AMO. Yeah, okay, so he won't, but he will definitely tell us his thoughts about megalopolitics, based partly, I hope, on the experience in those capacities. Reinier, he joined OMA in 1996 as a project director for De Rotterdam, which is basically supposed to be the Netherlands' largest building. It's on Wilhelmina Pier, isn't it? And this, how you can see the speed of the construction in the Netherlands. The building is still under construction. In 2002, he became a director of AMO and produced the Image of Europe. Image of Europe was the present of the Dutch government towards the European Union in terms of Dutch presidency upon the European Union. And he as well led a kind of, in 2009, a winning design competition for the Rotterdam Stadskantoor or Rotterdam City Hall extension, a sort of project which again is a bit on hold, but we hope will be soon realized. Of course, many other projects has been at OMA and AMO, which Reinier was working and developing. Here I have if I may show you one image. Yeah, the perhaps again the very important CV line of Reinier is that he graduated at the Berlage Institute in year 1992. Here is Hermann Herzberger giving or awarding him with the famous Berlage Master of Architecture diploma. But most importantly, I would really like to thank Reinier to continue actually working with many of the Berlage graduates at OMA and at OMA and the AMO, and many of our students are always, after graduation or actually before leaving the Netherlands, are telling me, you know, Vedran, the best package deal, 2 years Berlage, 1 year OMA. And Reinier clearly extended his 1 year of OMA till and definitely I would not like to say that he's stuck. I would like to say that he is actually the major force there. So Reinier, once again, thanks for coming. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you. So, thanks for this very charming introduction. I always see teaching as a break from work, so nothing of the project that Vedran spoke about will actually feature in the lecture, to get that clear. I would like to start tonight's lecture with a quote. I like thinking big. I always have. To me, it's very simple. If you're going to be thinking anyway, you might as well think big. I don't think it's in itself this quote that is particularly interesting. I think what makes this quote interesting is actually the combination of the person who said the quote. The person who said the quote in 1987, Donald Trump, in a book called The Art of the Deal. I think it's very interesting that apparently in the present day, thinking big has become the exclusive domain of proponents of the free market. And they claim the domain, and they claim the domain in an increasingly unabashed way. Thinking big and kicking ass. But if one looks at the track record of the free market, and particularly at the track record of the free market in domains that require thinking big, I think that track record is questionable. This is the relation of the free market to the domain of the green cause. And although you see a very impressive array of products, in a way they are all lip service, they're all small and they're all largely symbolic. So I think if one makes the balance of the free market, it is rather this. Thinking big, maybe, but kicking ass, definitely not. This is another quote. I like big ideas. I would describe myself as a comprehensive, anticipatory design scientist, an emerging synthesis of artist, inventor, mechanic, objective economist, and evolutionary strategist. This is not a quote of me. It is actually a quote of a very different person. It's a quote of more than 40 years ago of Richard Buckminster Fuller, who in professing the quote was equally bold, equally unabashed, but the key difference was that he was driven by an entirely different subject than the accumulation of accumulating personal wealth. And I think that difference is significant, and let's look. This is a project called Spaceship Earth. It was actually a project made for an address he held to the American Convention of Planners in 1968, which was actually a presentation about the Earth as a spaceship with a set amount of fuel that once exhausted could not be refueled. So it was a project as well as a very, very carefully calculated warning. This is another project, a project of the Dymaxion map, which actually underlies the idea of a global energy grid, which is meant to be the impetus of a more prudent use of resources once the whole world in its entirety would share it. This is another thinker from the same era, around about the same time, 1967, the Megalopolitic by Constantine Doxiades, who also thought global in the sense that the city was no more the product of nations, but the city was an international product, and this is a kind of a continuous band of urbanized regions that straddles the entire world. Of course, a lot of this work at the time happened against the background of a looming urgency. In 1972, the Club of Rome published a report, The Limits to Growth, which actually was all about the finiteness of resources, and which also was intended as a cautioning that if mankind continued to behave pretty much in the same way as it had, that in a way the Earth would end. And I think it is kind of interesting, although it's a dated and old report, to take stock of the present situation, and see how relevant the report is. This is a night map of the world. It's essentially the part that is light one could equate to the part that is urban. The part of the world that is urban occupies 2% of the territory, contains 50% of the people, uses 75% of the world's resources, and produces 80% of all the world's emissions. So a very asymmetrical situation that is continuing to be exacerbated. This is a map of global urbanization, deliberately portrayed as though it is a weather map. Because I think part of the current economy and the current system is that many man-made things actually are perceived as though they happen to you. As though they happen to you and you can actually do as much about them as you can do about the weather. But anyway, where you see light, there is growth. Where you see blue, there is no growth or there is shrinkage. And if one makes this map absolute, in other words, if one assumes that in the long run, where there is growth, there will be everything, where there is shrinkage, there will be nothing, the map of the world sort of looks like this. And with this map, looking at this map, actually that is not that far away from this. So to some extent one could say that an analysis of the facts on the ground today provides in a weird way a renewed relevance of old thoughts, and probably old thoughts that might have more to contribute to the situation than Donald Trump. Well, this graph is well known by now. The urban population on the rise, the rural population on the decline, with relatively recently the crossing point where now 50% of the people live in cities. But the trend is continuing, so it's probably already more than half, and it's continuing to be more. If one extrapolates the trend, one could imagine, and it's not far-fetched to think, that before the turn of the next century, almost 100% of all people will formally qualify as urban dwellers. That is not to say that each and every one will live in very, very dense cities, but that is more to say that probably agricultural production will be entirely taken care of by machines, and even those living in low density will probably have urban professions. But it's interesting to think about this. This is the planet Trantor. The planet Trantor is a phenomenon from a book by Isaac Asimov from 1950, Pebble in the Sky. Which is the world in 12,020. The world contains 40 billion people. The world is entirely urbanized. You see a kind of urban pattern all over the world. But because the world is very, very crowded, there is a forced euthanasia program which is called the 60, which means that at 60 you have to exit, which is also something that features in Michel Houellebecq's book. Anyway, if you're called the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, that kind of stuff, I guess is in a way right up your alley. But I think there is an interesting analogy to actually Rem's Delirious New York from 1978, which was a book that he once he described the true motive of writing about the book. Not necessarily out of an interest in New York, but out of an interest in the fact that mankind lived in a completely artificial, man-made situation in which nature had almost been eliminated or was partly framed as an isolated incident in the form of Central Park. But it's essentially another version of life in 100% urbanity. And of course, the current discourse on the rise of the megacity, with the urban condition becoming universal and larger, of course also gives a renewed relevance to those thoughts. Let's look at the megacity. I mean, the megacity is by now a universal phenomenon. It is also a universal academic topic. What can we say about it? If we use the word metropolitan, I think we could sort of vaguely claim that the origin of the word metropolitan is a Western origin. I think once we talk about the megacity, we can no longer say that. I don't think the megacity is the exclusive property of anything or anybody, but if it is the property of somebody, it is by now, or until now, largely an Asian phenomenon. This is a graph, in a way, the population of the whole world. If 50% is urban, already something like 60% is Asian, to the point that one equates or surfaces the other. And of course, a large part of Asia is China. It is generally assumed that, in a way, the market economy was introduced by the simultaneous election of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in 1980. I think there is, and that triggered a kind of global process of economic liberalization. I think there is a case that can be made that actually started earlier. And that process might have started in China. This is Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping, the then leader. Deng Xiaoping was the man who in 1978 introduced the famous open door policy. It was actually a plan to open up China to free trade and in a way, step by step, undo China of its dogmatic communist ideology in favor of an embrace of the free market. Of course, that made him very popular in the West. In the American Time magazine in the same year as the announcement, even before any visible effect, he was elected Man of the Year. But of course, since then, the track record of China is well documented and kind of well known. an enormous, since basically the introduction of the open door policy, an enormous sharp rise in the economic output of the country. But I don't think that in itself is even the most interesting phenomenon. I think the case of China is interesting because seemingly the case for economic development is inextricably linked to urbanization. To a very, very great effect. This is another graph. This is the rural net income, which over the years has gone up, but the urban disposable income goes up much faster. So if to get rich is glorious, the quickest path to get rich is to become an urban dweller. And the relation in the case of China goes so far that one can even wonder whether urbanization is a consequence of economic development or whether urbanization is in fact a means towards economic development and a conscious strategy which is not necessarily even demographic. Anyway, since 1978, real estate is an enormously important part of Chinese propaganda, and I think the fact that that is the case in a way alone gives an answer to the question. In China, by 2030, China will contain 1 billion urban dwellers and are larger urban dwellers than any other part of the world. China's model, in a way of linking economic development and urbanization very closely together, almost in an ideological way, is now by and large also a model followed by an increasing amount of cities in the developing world. This is a very interesting graph. It in a way shows urbanization and population growth of city in relation to GDP. So the correlation that you can find, if you have a very low GDP, your urbanization is very, very rapid. That rapid urbanization then in turn fuels another growth in GDP, which again fuels urbanization. And so there I think you can also see a very strange mix between cause and effect. These are the world's fastest growing cities, Beihai, but there's cities like Kabul, of course Lagos, Kinshasa, Nairobi, and much to my surprise also a place like Mogadishu, where clearly a situation of war in the countryside is actually a force that propels urbanization. But on the whole, a correlation between GDP and urbanization. This is the world divided with different nations according to different GDP categories. White is a high GDP, darker is a lower GDP, black is the lowest GDP. And what you see here is that invariably, with the exception of Los Angeles, actually the belt of cities that is rapidly growing, these are numbers not per week, not per day, but per hour. The band of cities that is rapidly growing seems to be a band of city that is propelling the development of the grey area, and maybe the cities are the means that eventually all the grey area will become white. That is seemingly the case. But let's take a closer look. Let's take a closer look if that proposition actually holds without any reserve. This is the world GDP growth, actually from 1900. You see a kind of rise in the 1950s and a very, very sharp rise in 1978. The number is not entirely coincidental given the earlier part of the talk. But anyway, in terms of GDP, the world is growing. But one can wonder how reliable that is as a performance indicator. This is a quote from 1960. Ever since monopoly capital took over the world, it has kept the greater part of humanity in poverty, dividing all the profits among the group of the most powerful. The standard of living of those is based on the extreme poverty of others. Che Guevara in his famous Algiers address. If you, in a way, do a little edit, you fast forward the quote in time. So 2012, if you read this quote, it could be true. In fact, if you look at other indicators, it is true. In 1978, the richest 10% of the world accounted for 40% of global wealth. In 2010, it's 88%. If it's 10%, that accounts for 88% of all global wealth. So to some extent what you see, that GDP alone as a performance indicator of wealth for many people doesn't suffice, as in fact incredibly useless. And also here, and this is the next paradox in the lecture, that actually what we've seen since the 1980s is, yes, a sharp rise in economic growth, but a very, very sharp rise in the equal distribution of wealth. And I think that tendency, that kind of vicious tendency, also creates a very, very dangerous proposition for the city. Let's look again at the graph that shows the rural and the urban. This time not in percentages, but this time in absolute numbers. So the rural diminishing, the urban very sharply on the rise. But the urban population, the rise in urban population is closely trailed by another kind of phenomenon. It's by another phenomenon that actually the world's slum population is more or less increasing about as rapidly as the world's urban population. So here there is a very, very weird paradox. If the city is what we aspire to, if by going to the city we hope to become wealthy, if the city is our model, that aspirational model is increasingly accommodated by a rather nasty economic reality, that the more you have of this, the more you want this, the more you have of that. And there is a kind of strange neck-and-neck race here between GDP and urbanization on the one hand, and on the other hand, actually a general well-being, which isn't one-on-one the same thing. Sorry. So, this was the urban growth in relation to GDP. This is the same urban growth in relation to the political situation in the world. You've probably all heard the joke. Red is dictatorship. Yellow is pseudo-democracy, here is electoral democracy. Yellow is of course a very interesting category because you have elections, but you know the outcome in advance. Which means that if we once thought the entire world was going to be blue because democracy was so persuasive that everybody would eventually join it, I think it's probably safer to say that eventually the entire world will be yellow, because it provides dictators a very easy transition to democracy because they don't have to relinquish powers, but it also provides a very tempting alternative to democratic leaders who also want to retain to power. And I think the Berlusconi model, etc., the Putin model, etc., are very, very interesting examples. Anyway, Almanach, the book of 2007, written about Dubai. Dubai is another interesting phenomena. If in the case of China, one could argue that there is a certain relation to the growth of cities and the demographic development of the country. In other words, that there is an authentic indigenous need for people to be housed. In Dubai, this is not the case. In Dubai, that relationship is the other way round. If the cities in China are built for people who need those cities, in Dubai, the cities are built hoping to attract the people that will live in the city. So the city in itself is a kind of form of announcement. This is Sheikh Zayed Road in 1990. This is the same road in 2003, already hopelessly out of date. But it shows a city built from scratch in kind of less than 10 years. Or less than 50 years. Nothing in the picture is older than 50 years, which has simply been created to take the country away from a dominance of oil. Oil reserves were depleted, the economy needed to be diversified. The case for Dubai, the city was the best ticket to diversifying its economy and this best ticket to economic performance. Every building leads to an announcement of the next, to the point that actually built activity isn't just built activity, but built activity is very important because it allows the announcement of built activity, which is a kind of marketing that attracts people, which again leads to more built activity. So there's a close relation to those things. I mean, there is the phenomenon where there are the celebrity citizens supposed to attract other celebrity citizens, models, and sales offices become bigger and bigger. To the point that they actually replace the city as a kind of virtual reality. It's also the only city, interestingly enough, that always shows a map of the way it is not. This is not there, this is not there, This is there but in bad state. This is not there. This is no longer there, I think, and that's too far east. It is interesting. So the city in itself is its forward image. The city in itself is its projected image into the future, to the point that the city, in a way, is a spectacle. In a way, one could read Dubai as a city. One could also read Dubai as a collection of theme parks, as a collection of individual developments who are mutually competing in terms of imago, in terms of projecting an image to attract prospective development. So here, you have a completely unique condition that one, in a way, has a kind of monotony of the exceptional, that in a way icons become boring, that extravagance equals boredom, which is, I guess, very 21st century condition. These developments are made by an infinite amount of companies and property development companies. One could actually think that because of that, Dubai is a free market that allows competitions between private developer. The reality is different. If one traces the origin of property development companies long enough, one ends up with 3 holdings. If one traces those 3 holdings, one ends up at a 51 majority shareholdership of the royal family. So in a way, it's a complete monopoly, which simulates a kind of free market condition. This is, in a way, members of the government. This is the major CEOs of property development companies, and it's well, it's not because of the custom of dressing that they look the same. They are the same people. So whereas you could say that in an established democracy, let's say in the blue part of the world, leaving your business interests behind the moment you take up political office, here is the opposite. Business interests become a prerequisite to be a politician. So it's a complete merger, essentially, of the political and the business sphere, to the point that actually the city-state, the emirate, acts like a corporation that even exports itself to other countries. This is Cityscape Dubai. Very confident predicament. One day all cities will be built like this. And for a long time, and I think until the crisis of 2008, a lot of this was happening. And even though the crisis hit Dubai hard, I still think it's interesting to dwell on this. If you look at Emaar, for instance, you see that basically Emaar had property developments going on all the way from Morocco, straddling across the Middle East, India, all the way to the Philippines. So that they, in a way, were serving a part of the world, the part of the world that we've seen is the most rapidly growing, with a kind of model. And one can be very derogatory about that kitschy model, but I think it's not a coincidence that this model was so successful. Because if you look at this graph, in a way the graph that shows the urbanization of North America, of Europe and of Asia, going back to 1900, you see Europe and America growing very fast until the 1960s, then the curve flattens, and as of 1980, Asia takes a sharp rise. What you see in the bottom here are the major titles of books written about the city by Western academic thinkers. That sort of ended somewhere around the 1980s. So again, more or less in the year that Deng announced its open door policy, gave rise to a massive urbanization in China, the West decided to stop thinking. There is one exception. This Jane Jacobs' last book, The Dark Age Ahead. But that's a kind of evidence of thinking which sees such a gloomy picture that it's not really a tempting alternative for anyone to pick up. And what is all of this saying? In a way, what it is saying is that there is now an enormous urbanization, which is in a way a vast, neglected theoretical field. While we dwell like this, there are others who claim that field. This is a Google map of vision. Vision 2020, Vision 2020, Vision, 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 Vision. I mean, not a single vision produced by an architect. This is a vision, a roadmap, very popular word, Vision 25 for the urban future of India, produced by an NGO. A vision for the National Development Plan for Jamaica, produced by another NGO. Vision 2020 for Moscow, Idaho. Vision 2020 for London, Canada. So there is no city insignificant enough that it doesn't have a vision. The only thing is that very rarely anymore is that vision produced by architects. The visions are now produced by PricewaterhouseCoopers, our accountants at OMA. The vision centers around value. What is value to you? Jones Lang LaSalle, another property company, real value in a changing world. McKinsey & Company, value through transformation. Transformation, of course, consulted and advised by McKinsey itself. Let's take a closer look at McKinsey. McKinsey did a project for Mumbai, which they called Vision Mumbai, of course. In very confident language, the situation at present is such that most policymakers and agencies governing the city refuse to even believe that Mumbai, which is seemingly insurmountable, can transform itself to a world-class city, whatever that may be in 10 to 15 years frame. This report aims to show the way for Mumbai to do just that. So there we go. The skyline of this world-class city actually looks suspiciously like the statistics McKinsey produced in its consultancy report, but maybe that confusion is interesting, because I think if you take the earlier example of China, where in a way the development of the city and the development of the economy are one and the same thing. If you take the case of Dubai, where they're definitely one of the same thing, where the city for sure is a means towards the economy, maybe it's not so strange that you turn to a business consultant to help you. But let's look at this. They deal with transportation, housing, healthcare, education, safety, governance. I mean, all indicators there except space. I mean, that's an indicator that has completely vanished from the equation. Where do these indicators come from? It is very interesting to look at this. There are a number of rankings, the FT, rankings by The Economist, rankings by the World Bank, etc., which in a way now list cities in terms of livability. Monaco uses this in a way to give people expat package, and then the level of livability in the city is decided to determine the size of an expat package of a worker who goes there. Vancouver, Melbourne, Perth, Toronto, a very heavily Anglo-Saxon dominated world image, which all in a way answer to a same set of criteria, and of course any limited list of criteria is an infinite reduction of the complex phenomena that eventually is the city, but so it is. So economic growth and stability, healthcare, culture and environment, education and infrastructure, and it's precisely those things that of course feature in the McKinsey graph. In other words, what they do is maybe not necessarily even help Mumbai to become a more interesting city. What they do is to help Mumbai to rise up the list in a context of global competition between cities. In that sense, this is an interesting example. The example from Singapore, which in a way now also markets itself as an epitome of livability. The Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize, so that's what they host, that's what they have. But in a way, by claiming wisdom about the subject, they in a way also export their own model, to the sense that Singapore as a model of ticking all of those boxes, also interestingly not a democratic model like Dubai, stands now model in Singapore, in China, another model in China. It's increasingly the model that is being copied. This is another city. I believe it's London, but it doesn't really matter where it is. What is interesting that the author or the planner of this city is IKEA. So a furniture company now becomes an urban planner. Welcome to IKEA land. IKEA is building a city in London. Did you ever dream of an entire city filled with Swedish meatballs and do-it-yourself furniture? That dream could soon become a reality. So here you go, residential quarter, hub quarter, I mean almost an OMA project. There you go. Another example, a technology giant, which now acts up as a city planner, a holistic approach for the entire Siemens portfolio. Hey, this doesn't work. What is interesting here is that, of course, somebody like Siemens who plans a city, do they really want to plan the city, or is the city for them a market? Where essentially they do not plan the city, but where they try to sell or try to sort of implement as many of their products, which will then create a long-term dependency of that city on those projects. So the city to them is a business model. Their planning report for the city is in fact a bid book. Anyway, and you can see it here, I mean, energy and harbours accommodate precisely the areas where they deliver technologies, become indispensable ingredients of any city. The absolute champion of this is Bertel. I mean, almost Donald Trump-like rhetoric, ideas that mean business, which actually see the city as an opportunity to collect as many mega projects as possible. Which means essentially they're a kind of what you call a non-stop shop as a consultant, that they can deliver the entire package to the whole thing, to the point that they claim such a monopoly for mega projects that it's even leading to protests, where they're heavily involved in the reconstruction of Iraq. Iraq is not your sandbush, metal book. So even to some extent, public outroar about it. There's another trend of privatization and another trend that I think is a worrying trend, and a trend which potentially de-wrenches a world as we've known it. As the rural community on the countryside declined, the category of the residual is on the rise. So if this is the Doxiadis image with the continuous world city of the future, in that configuration there are these spots which will be left behind. You can see a tendency there already that these spots are increasingly subject to a phenomenon which is called land grabbing, where in a way private companies or small states with a shortage of land actually do land acquisitions in large country like Russia or Ukraine. Here you see the white are non-targeted, they're the perpetrators. The ones with the black hatch are actually the ones targeted, where they do large land acquisitions, partly for food production, increasingly also for biofuel and energy production, but essentially a world defined by states, a world defined by national borders, is in a way blurring as a result, or blurring in the wake of the neglect of the countryside. Millions of hectares bought. Food policy research in a Washington-based think tank has estimated that 15, 20 million hectares, particularly in poor countries, have been sold or were under negotiations to foreign buyers. And of course this is particularly the continent that is, of course, first and foremost targeted by this is Africa, as it has the least economic resistance to that whole phenomenon. There's an article, 21st century African land rush. The accumulative supply of land held by Agriza, the South African Farmers Union in the Republic of Congo, 24.7 million acres. That is the size of South Korea. That is the size of an entire country held by a private company in another country. That is quite interesting that it is the size of Korea, because Korea is itself one of the most aggressive land acquirers in the world, to the point that Korea lands in alien farmlands and plants its flag. This may seem ridiculous, but the Russians have actually planted their flag on the North Pole, a rust-proof titanium flag to sort of preemptively claim all the oil reserves that are under the North Pole. Anyway, next paradox. The rise of the city, is it at the expense of the nation? Is the fact that now more and more people live in cities, that cities will eventually change the concept we have of the nation? Let's look at this. Australia, the GDPs again. Australia, 300 million, Sweden. Actually, those GDPs are both surpassed by cities. So to some extent we see a situation that the economic output of a city and the population of a city passes that of an entire country, 2 cases. Nevertheless, neither of these cities has a seat in the United Nations. Neither of these cities is politically embedded or represented in the same way as countries. So you see these type of countries developing increasingly into a hinterland with a disproportionate, an increasingly disproportionate amount of power in the face of the cities growing. The world's 40 largest mega-regions only cover 3% of the Earth's surface, yet they account for 66% of all economic activity and 85% of all scientific innovation. That's an interesting statement. Let's look again at the planet Trantor by Asimov. This is science fiction. And it is particularly science fiction because this is not actually what is happening. What is happening is actually quite a different phenomenon. What is happening more is that urbanization and what happens in its wake hits us almost like climate change hits us. This is the Earth's surface, the full land mass. This is if you forget about areas, if you only leave the areas with more than 25 people per square kilometer. If you only keep the areas with more than 50 if you only get under 20 and if the event you only keep the reason. You see that it's Al Gore in the making. Not through the rising of the sea level, but through a kind of willful abandonment of large territories of land. This is our political model that accompanies it, a kind of speculative model that would in a way give large city regions an equivalent amount of power and representation in international relations as countries do at present, and this is one of the speculations in the studio. Reminiscent of the old city-states, which had large areas named after them. Nevertheless, their power was concentrated and equated to the city, and the boundaries between one city-state and another state were actually very, very blurry. The word polis, as we know it, of course means city, but it's closely semantically related to the word politics. So in that sense it is interesting to think about the city because it is both a concept that is about space, but it's also a concept that is about political organization and representation. And the city is a domain apparently limited enough that actually one can equal the other. In the concept of a nation, this is much more problematic. And then of course that would mean that the megalopolis would, well, I think this kind of speaks for itself, would require megalopolitics. Megalopolitics, what are they supposed to address? Because of course any concept about politics in the present day, where the public sector is massively on the retreat in the face of an enormous urban growth, is a very, very tricky proposition. Let's look at the same statistic as before. We see that cities now economically surpass entire countries. But ironically, cities in turn are again surpassed by corporations who still command even larger communities than the cities and who in turn dwindle the size of the city. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, 51 are corporations. General Motors is bigger than Denmark. Daimler Chrysler is bigger than Poland. Royal Dutch Shell is bigger than Venezuela. IBM is bigger than Singapore. Sony is bigger than Pakistan. Sorry. This is another quote. The main thesis is that big business, having achieved a monopoly or a cartel position in most markets of importance, fuses eventually with government apparatus. A kind of financial oligarchy or conglomerate therefore results, whereby government officials aim to provide the social and the legal framework within which giant corporations can operate most effectively. This is a close partnership between big business and government, and it's argued that the aim is to integrate labor units completely in that partnership. In other words, the whole dialectic of power resolved in a kind of mega conglomerates. This is a quote, not a quote, I mean this is a summary of the theory of Karl Marx. An even older thinker than Buckminster Fuller, but let's look. Global economic entities. There's countries, we've mentioned cities, and we've mentioned corporations. Red, blue, and green. Here ranked according to category, here ranked according to size. So what you see is a complete blur in the world between nations, cities, and corporations in terms of size. That if you zoom in on that list, kind of Walmart bigger than Osaka, bigger than Norway, BP larger than Greece and larger than Atlanta, Fannie Mae bigger than Kuwait, etc. Well, the list is endless, and these examples are of course very interesting. Cisco has a bigger economy than Lebanon, Ford has a bigger economy than Morocco, Walmart has a bigger economy than Norway. Cumulatively, all of those companies occupy a large part of the world, and like a kind of in parallel to the land grabbing shown earlier, here you have a kind of power game where, in a way, if you express their relevance in territory, you can't see the world very properly, but I mean, this summation alone is something like 30% of the Earth's surface. That would not be worrying if it were not for the fact that globalization has a very peculiar effect on companies. I think one can make the case that before the economy truly globalized, there was some implied loyalty in a big company towards the nation in which it was founded. I think what we currently see with kind of shareholder systems and the way it worked is that that loyalty is by no means evident anymore. And in a way, the allegiance in the threesome has now shifted towards the world, leaving the nation that can largely not count on its corporations anymore. And the evidence of that is abundant. This is another report on kind of some of the large companies that we compared to the size of countries, kind of increasingly eager to pay as little tax as possible, or if possible to evade tax altogether. So that is paradox number 5. Corporate growth is actually accompanied by a dwindling corporate loyalty. The whole world feels that, and I think if one looks at the anti-globalists, or if one looks at protests in France, everybody has a very, very uncomfortable feeling with this. People do not feel that their political systems actually adequately protect them against a phenomena where essentially money walks away. I think this is one of the reasons, one of the true reasons why somebody like Putin has remained so popular in Russia. This is why people often go for leaders, not because of their democratic instincts, but of the amount of credible resistance they mount against this very phenomena. There was a very interesting article in the January issue of The Economist. The rise of state capitalism was largely about Russia and China. Here, there's again an interesting bit of arithmetic that can be done. This is an overview of the countries by GDP. Dark is very high, light is increasingly lower. This is the list of countries with the largest GDP, 75 of them. But of course, all of these GDPs, which are now represented in terms of countries, if you take the previous slide, where actually corporations are not loyal to their countries, but loyal to themselves and to the world, to what extent does this list actually correspond to reality? Because if you look at the GDP of the US, the largest GDP in the world, the China GDP, which is a lot smaller, but it's still a very, very large economy. If you look at how that GDP is built up, what you see is that the US GDP, for about 80%, consists of the accumulated wealth of private companies. The Chinese GDP for about 40%. So if you do your sums then, US GDP, 14, private sources deducted, you leave 2, private sources deducted in China, you actually have a reversal of fortune, where actually China has a considerably larger GDP than the United States. Simply, if one deducts the private as a kind of third entity which can go either way. So, looking again at the list, a massive amount of countries drop. What is red drops, what is green rises, and a completely new list emerges. So, one can wonder what that implies for a kind of world order. This is a map of Soviet-aligned countries in 1975, and I still think this map, by and large, continues to partly determine the world as it is today. Although China is only officially communist, of course Moscow and Russia is not. But what happened in the 90s, after the breakdown of communism, and what is the stereotypical picture, is of course that if one draws the onion map where one represents territory as GDP, normally Europe and America are bloated. If one would apply the same sums as we've just applied in our thing, probably a very different world would arise, where the balance in end would tip. And I see partly the economic crisis that we see happening at the moment is evidence of that, to the point that a world emerges in which part has gone missing. It's early days to say what kind of influence this will have, and what kind of influence this will particularly have in our countries and in the western part of the world. Maybe, this is the word at one point, the thesis will be met by an antithesis, in some extent a different kind of rhetoric, a more progressively dominated West. Who's to say? It's a bit of a joke, of course, and the lecture is partly a joke, but partly serious. But what in a way we are dealing with, or what in a way we are trying to explore, is a number of inherent frictions as they happen in the world. And those asymmetries and those paradoxes and those paradigm shifts actually create such a different situation that the way the world is governed and administered is increasingly out of touch with the demographic and economic reality as it is emerging on the ground. And of course, that asymmetry can only go so far before it reaches a breaking point. And to speculate what might happen after the breaking point is actually the subject of the class, which ends tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Could you put some light? Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Reinier. It's very witty, very fascinating research what you're doing. Clearly, it's not a joke. I think it's.
That's not research.
Yeah. But it is the way in which you are doing it, right? So exposing what you would call inherent frictions, right? Yeah. And they are there. Of course, a level of, the way in which you can manipulate the data or kind of, underline the manipulation with a certain graphics is present. But nevertheless, here we have, I think, a radical change. Yeah. And this change is something what many people has been arguing, that actually globalization is in a way Americanization, and that and Joseph Stiglitz he published these two books, one about how globalization is not working, and another one how it should work. And clearly I think what I was missing when I was reading these two books by Stiglitz, I was exactly missing your diagrams. I think they would be incredibly good support. They would not be scientific, of course.
Yeah, people always ask us to visualize formal conclusions.
Yeah, but how could you say something more about the method and visualization? And the way,
well, visualization is InDesign and Photoshop.
Is it?
The method is kind of part of a very internal trade secret.
But here we are grilling you, so you have to open a bit.
I think what we do is not research, is not scientific. No. It maybe is visualization, but and in that sense we're different from a lot of companies. We operate on hunches, but the hunches are not falling out of the sky. The hunches are very much rooted in a kind of experience, professional experience, anecdotal experience that we come across while we do our job. Yeah. All over the world, and pretty much as a kind of byproduct from doing building A there, master plan C there, you encounter the world in its full incompatibility. You realize perfectly the completely different language that people speak, and you also realize very, very well that value systems which in certain parts of the world are held to be universal certainly are not. And the kind of nice realization from that is in the end everybody is a minority. And
but you've been as well often perhaps mistaken or criticized by actually flirting with those forces. And what you are doing here are really exposing those forces. Nevertheless, with those companies and with those forces, you have to work in your, let's say, office practice. Yeah. So how you here perform, should we call the metaphor of the server or the metaphor of you know, postmodern layers of different identities of current professionalism, how you would play in a practice, so not in a pseudo-scientific research, but in a practice in order to introduce the arguments, the agendas, which would be, you know, close to your, how to say, hardened mind.
Well, I think that is a complex discussion. Because I don't think architects ever had power, but maybe politicians had power at some stage. I think we're seeing a situation where politicians also have no power anymore. The neoliberal agenda is being executed. If you have a left-wing government, it's being executed. If you have a right-wing government, it's being executed in an accelerated way. So in that sense, the only way to some extent actively pursue a political agenda, it cannot be by an imposition or by a blunt confrontation of power, it's probably through projects. Right. It's probably through projects in which you use the forces at work to turn the forces against the forces at work. And that's why everything we do is a kind of irritating mix between seriousness and irony, between flirt and opposition, and as pretty much our profession is.
Yeah. Thanks. Your questions to Reinier de Graaf? Here we are.
Hi. I'm actually going to ask a follow-up question of Vedran's first question, which is having worked with you for like the last 4 days in this masterclass, the issue of this research and the methodology we adopt this, it was also already questioning my mind, and I would actually like to work on hunches is corresponding to actually Freud's working way, because Freud's he was also working on based on his experience with the people that he was working with, and he's been extremely discredited in the psychology world because he was not this way of working on hunches was not believable today, and so his theories are really not taken seriously in today's the level that the psychology science has reached. So
but that trait, but at the same time Freud is great because he's so persuasive, and that Freud has in common with Le Corbusier, and that Freud has in common with Karl Marx. Ultimately, is that the fact that all what they produced is in a form of persuasion, but I think, be that as it may, it still makes the work very, very powerful, even though one could argue that the damage Corbusier's thoughts has done to the cities is enormous. It's at the same time great. I think I hate reading psychoanalysis. I love reading Freud. I hate to read people who write about Karl Marx. I like to read Karl Marx. And in that sense, that I guess also in part and parcel philosophical theory, which actually equates one to the other, you know, which is again a speculative theory.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Can you pass the microphone?
Thanks for the lecture, and I'm very interested in the topic you referred to about the uneven distribution of wealth in the city. And my question would be, how would you envision the city in the future? Like, which model do you think is more competitive? Is it the city which will have a very strong hierarchy and complexity within it?
I think the city of the future is polycentric. It's the kind of city that evolves from having 1 centers to 4 centers, which are probably related to their airports, which then, in a way, are the home of thematized communities, which also undo the mix between living and working, and in passing solve the traffic problem. This was the description of a project. But,
another question? Are you satisfied with that?
Just another question. Like, how do you think about the 2 types of city? That one is like with a very strong hierarchy. The other is like just a collection of a group of wealthy people where everybody can get its portion of wealth, like a part of cake, and everybody is equally wealthy. Like, it's 2 kind of models for the city.
I don't know of a city where everyone is equally wealthy, but if it were to indeed exist, I'd be very interested in it.
Okay, so you don't think it's a future model where
well,
the city would
of course
envision itself
a
to
very
be?
noble aspiration.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Further questions?
Okay.
You all want to go to work? For tomorrow?
Let's go for it.
Again,
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.